Tuare gobo chiake. Siaku tua beniko, na kulemira beniko yo. Horo wa guthi mutituri. Ndiganagirwo ni njui hindi ria ndathire.
Na twahoyaga Ngai atigie umwe agacokia mbeu. Tutiaiguaga ruo ni gukua. No twaiguaga ruo ni riri, ni kuherithio.
Mararaita. We nginya riu ndunengere bunduki.
Yukoda.
When we think of the Mau Mau War, Kenya's bold and bloody march toward liberation, certain images rise unbidden. Forest fighters wielding homemade guns and machetes, secret oathing ceremonies whispered under cover of darkness, and the crushing weight of colonial repression bearing down on homes, hopes, and generations. But buried beneath these powerful images lies a truth too often ignored. For too long, history has cast women as bystanders in this revolution, as grieving widows, silent supporters, or distant figures watching from the sidelines. Yet nothing could be further from the truth. Scholar Margaret Gachihi reminds us that women were not simply a supporting cast in the Mau Mau revolution.
Women were a critical and decisive element in the shape that the Mau Mau assumed. Without their active cooperation and assistance, Mau Mau would certainly not have been as effective or survived as long as it did.
Caroline Elkins, in Imperial Reckoning, echoes this in her searing account of Britain's counterinsurgency in Kenya.
British intelligence officers noted with alarm that women were the eyes and ears of Mau Mau, and that some were even more militant than their menfolk. They were central to the movement's success.
These truths are not only preserved by scholars, but by veterans, survivors, and ironically, even the colonial powers who came to fear them. So why then do we barely know their names? Why are their stories not etched into our national memory with the reverence they deserve and the prominence they earned? This is their story, unburied, unflinching, and unforgettable. To understand their courage, we must start from the beginning. Before the Mau Mau War, before the oaths and ambushes, the roots of women's resistance were already deep in the soil. One of the earliest and most iconic moments of defiance came in 1922, after the arrest of nationalist leader Harry Tuku. As protests erupted outside Nairobi's Central Police Station, a young Kikuyu woman named Mary Mutoni Nyanjiru stood in the crowd. She tore off her blouse, a gesture of spiritual defiance in Kikuyu culture, and shouted, "You men are cowards! If you cannot rescue Tuku, we will!" Her words electrified the crowd. But moments later, colonial police opened fire. Nyanjiru was among the first to fall, yet her death lit a torch. She was no victim. She was a spark. Her defiance shattered the colonial image of African women as submissive. Nyanjiru had drawn a line in the sand, setting a precedent for generations of women who would not only protest, they would fight. In the 1940s, the embers of rebellion grew stronger. In Muranga, Central Province, 1947, women rose again, faced with a massive colonial land terracing program. Women, who made up more than half the workforce, abruptly put down their tools. They refused to continue unpaid communal labor, which took them away from their farms, children, and homes. They worked long hours twice a week beside men under coercion. But on that day in 1947, they said no more. The women's protest brought the entire initiative to a halt. By August, men joined in. The government had no choice but to back down. But this was not just about terracing. In 1951, the flames of resistance flared again, this time over cattle. The government ordered mandatory inoculation against rinderpest for all African cattle. When the inoculated animals began dying, women in Muranga organized. They stormed vaccination centers. They burned down 11 cattle boomers. Over 500 women were arrested. Many were sentenced to jail. They were not criminals. They were mothers protecting their only source of livelihood. They were fighters, daring to say no to arbitrary colonial policies. Resistance was not limited to Muranga. In 1934, thousands of Abatuguchi women in Meru marched to protest the colonial exhumation of buried bodies, an act that violated cultural rights. They believed the desecration had caused drought and famine. In 1939, Igembe women, enraged by economic exploitation, looted an Indian trader's store over unfair prices. Each of these acts was a flashpoint, but together, they lit a fire, a movement, a sisterhood of rebellion. To understand the role women played in the Mau Mau struggle, we must first rewind. Back to a time before colonial rule, before the British came, before the white man redrew boundaries of land, of power, and of gender. In pre-colonial Kikuyu society, roles were distinct and respected. Men were warriors and decision-makers. Women were nurturers, guardians of the land, the home, and the lineage. Their contribution was central to the survival and continuity of the community. As Caroline Elkins observes in Imperial Reckoning, the untold story of Britain's Gulag in Kenya,
A woman needed land to grow crops to nurture and sustain her family. Without it, she was not an adult. A Kikuyu could not be a Kikuyu without land.
Women in traditional Kikuyu life, they had their own hut, had their own piece of land where they farmed, they produced their produce, took it to the market or give it away. The rest they saved in a granary, ikombe. So the woman has a lot of autonomy in her own hut, in her own garden, and whatever she did with her produce was not her husband's what? Business. Okay? So that was the Kikuyus.
women's lives moved with the rhythm of seasons, of farming, of family. A harmony that was slowly dismantled with the onset of colonialism. British conquests brought with it massive land alienation. Elkins reports that more than 60,000 acres were seized from Kikuyu communities, forcing them into overcrowded and impoverished reserves.
Atongo maimite kwao Ruraya magoka magaikara guku na riu tugatuka ngombo ciao ni mbara twaruire ni gututunya migunda gututunya ithaka citu ciana citu ri iria twina cio ri na hatumia itu ri mandekage riu wathirwo na mwana waku athwo na muthuri athwo na mutumia athwo riu magetahira guku ni kwao tutiri na ithuĩ tutiri kindu ni ruo ruu.
The result was economic disintegration and the erosion of traditional systems of land tenure, inheritance, and family structure. With men pulled into the colonial labor economy, detained, conscripted, or driven to urban centers, women were left to hold together what remained of family life. They took over farming entirely, working degraded and overused land to feed their children and communities. Women assumed nearly all agricultural duties.
As colonial administrators intensified demands for food production, traditional farming practices like crop rotation and fallowing were abandoned under pressure, leaving the soil and the women exhausted.
In cities like Nairobi, women adapted yet again. As David Anderson records in Histories of the Hanged, The Dirty War in Kenya and the End of Empire, African women entered male-dominated spaces of trade and small business.
Those who came to run businesses in transport or trade had ambitions and aspirations to better themselves.
Urban life for Africans was a constant battle for employment, housing, and dignity. Women became informal traders, brewed illicit beer, sold vegetables, and ran dukas, small shops that sustained families and resistance alike. Noting Kikuyu women's increasing visibility and political consciousness, colonial authorities struggled to understand why women were joining the Mau Mau in such significant numbers. Conditioned by patriarchal assumptions, the British expected African women to remain passive and submissive. They viewed women's militancy as an anomaly, and several colonial reports attempted to rationalize it through patronizing and often contradictory theories. One popular colonial belief suggested that Kikuyu women were historically oppressed under traditional systems and therefore welcomed the Mau Mau as a form of liberation, even if that liberation came through violence. According to this flawed reasoning, women found a place to feel at home within Mau Mau ranks, where they were accepted as equals because the movement needed to expand its numbers. From this, the argument went, women derived a newfound status in the world. Another theory claimed that women joined the rebellion as a way to draw their men back to the so-called primitive ways, an effort to reclaim a cultural identity lost to modernity. Still others went so far as to suggest that women were drawn to Mau Mau for the excitement and entertainment it offered, in contrast to the monotony of life under colonialism.
Iyo ya kuga ati nie ndikendia ruriri oguo ri uria ruriri rukuga ni hodi no ndie mwena wa muthu wa muthungu ni twatuite ya kurwa mbara na muthungu nginya tukamuota.
In any war, the unity of the fighters determines the success or lack thereof. The Mau Mau oath was far more than a symbolic act. It was a sacred and binding pledge of loyalty, secrecy, and resistance. Traditionally, oathing in Kikuyu society was the preserve of men, especially within the warrior and age-set systems. But during the Mau Mau War, women boldly entered this once exclusive realm. Under moonlit skies and in hidden homesteads, they took the oath in clandestine ceremonies, risking their lives to join the fight for land and freedom.
Niumere twambite kunywa tutatonyete mutituri niyo ya kiama akuingira kiama na wakeri ndigirikana uria wetagwo wa gatatu ni wa batuni wa batoni niguo warĩ ũgwati warĩ ũgwati atĩrĩrĩ rĩu we ũyũ wa batoni rĩu mũtitũ nĩ ũkũingĩra tũnyue tondũ gũkũ nĩ gũgĩthũkire rĩ tũkamĩrũĩre kũrĩa thĩinĩ.
As Amanda E. Lewis explains in A Kenyan Revolution, Mau Mau, Land, Women and Nation.
The group of people who became known as Mau Mau bound themselves to each other through the oath. They ate an oath by literally consuming meat, red soil, or some other designated medium, pledging themselves to the subversion of British colonialism and ultimately to independence.
They were very clever. They knew you don't start with the Christians. Oathing. Oathing started with non-Christian in Gatondo, where I'm talking about. So they called them because those people were close to their culture. They started with the people who knew the meaning of being a Kikuyu. They would be given the oath, a statement, that you'll never betray. And then I was being told, I never saw this, you would go around like 7 times and they would also, of course, have some blood and mixed with cow dung, I mean, the intestines, how you comedia, how you take out that is what they would, something to really know, this is blood. Blood is sacred. So the idea of what we are doing this in sacredness because blood is life and life connects to God. So we are doing this and God is with us. And if you betray this, may you die. So there was no respect for life for somebody who cannot feel bound to that oath.
Among the oath leaders were powerful female spiritual figures, like Waruguru of Gitini, a seer whose rituals infused the rebellion with ancestral legitimacy. She not only conducted oathing ceremonies, but also prophesied future victories, terrifying the colonial administration. As S.M. Shamsul Alam observes in Rethinking Mau Mau in Colonial Kenya,
the oath-taking ceremony was often presided over by women diviners and seers, bringing spiritual and ancestral authority to the movement.
Once oathed, women became deeply embedded in the resistance infrastructure. They were not just supporters, they were operatives. They provided food and medicine to fighters hiding in the forests, transported messages between Mau Mau units, smuggled weapons under their skirts, and used coded language in market stalls to relay intelligence. Some, as the war intensified, even took up arms and joined fighters in the forest. One of the most legendary among them was Field Marshal Muthoni Kirima, who joined the movement in her early 20s and rose to become one of the few women to hold a senior military title within the Kenya Land and Freedom Army.
Wewe warwagira mwena uriku?
Ni
Area iriku?
Nyandarua. Kai kore koto koge kwarwaga ni tiga Nyandarua na Kirinyaga. Ako kutukare gotuko. Tie ni situgari Kirinyaga. Waika ko tukamenya wakuo. Kaugare mukinyesia mukwenda atia murona ogwo twathi atugakora muthungu kamwira turenda mucinga na bathitora na rucio ri woe mirigo thie kwanyu ana ogwo agwika twamutiga ri akamberia ona ndoheaga irio ciothe kamberia gwika gwithara.
She remained in the forest for over a decade, commanding troops and organizing supply chains, a living embodiment of female defiance against both colonialism and gender norms. Another woman of extraordinary courage was Kagunyu, who acted as a Mau Mau courier and messenger. Known for her daring and speed, Kagunyu often ran across ravines and valleys carrying food, letters, and small arms. She helped map enemy movements and provided critical forest-to-village links.
Bara rĩ, bara yambĩrĩirie kĩndũ 1952. Na niĩ kĩambĩrĩria ndarĩ mũirĩtu mũnene, ndiarĩ mwana, ndarĩ mũndũ mũnene. Na bara nĩgetha ĩtũrĩke yambĩrĩrie rĩ, niĩ ndarĩ kũndũ gwĩtagwo Ndondo, magĩtũma mũndũ oke angĩre. Ngĩgĩrwo ũtukũ ũcio, twĩgĩthiĩ rĩu nao gĩthaka. Twathiĩ nao gĩthaka kũrĩa kũndũ gwĩtagwo Ngũniũ. Rĩu tũkiuma Ngũniũ nao, tondũ magũcoka no magacoka manyumĩrie ũndũ ngũka ũguo nyumĩre ngacoka gũkũ. Nĩho maherire rĩtwa Kangũniũ. Nĩmwaigua kũu gwetwo Ngũniũ? Rĩtwa ndaherwo kũ? Nĩ ũndũ nĩndamahonokirie kĩ? Ngĩheo rĩtwa Kangũniũ. Na macokire rĩu makĩndehe ũguo, o magĩikũrũka ũguo, no nĩ ngũtũmwo ta marũa. Nĩ ũrĩa marũa twekagĩra posta. Rĩu ngũtũmwo nawe mũndũ atware ũcio ũngĩ kĩ. No mũndũ wao ndirĩ, ona ũguo kĩnengerwo niĩ ndingĩnengerwo mũndũ oro ũguo, ngũnengerwo mũndũ moĩ nũũ manenganĩrĩria. Nĩgetha njoke kĩanda tondũ no ndĩmaheaga ũhoro.
Caroline Elkins, in Imperial Reckoning, emphasizes that women provided the Mau Mau with food, water, and intelligence, adding that their role was critical to the insurgency's survival. So effective were their operations that British authorities grew alarmed.
The question of what to do with the hundreds of thousands of women who took the Mau Mau oath plagued the colonial government.
This underscores how deeply embedded women were in the movement. David Anderson, in Histories of the Hanged, reinforces this reality. He explains that women played a vital role in keeping the lines of supply and communication open, particularly in urban areas like Nairobi. Their ability to move inconspicuously made their participation even more dangerous than that of men.
Na ndi wake wambĩrĩria gĩthaka na kũrĩkia. Na nginya andũ mataingĩrĩte gĩthaka nĩ ndatwaragĩra Kĩmathi riboti ũrĩa kũrerwo nĩ Omugati na kĩ.
As British surveillance intensified and mass detentions escalated, women adapted. With many male fighters in hiding or imprisoned, women's roles became even more critical as their homes became safe houses, their farms and businesses disguised critical supply depots.
Women's resistance was born out of survival, but it evolved into something far more potent, a quiet, consistent, and fearless insurgency that defied colonial expectations.
From the sacred oath under moonlight to the battlefield in the forests, women like Field Marshal Muthoni and Kagunyu refused to remain in the background. They stepped forward, not only as caretakers of resistance, but as its commanders and custodians.
Ora mutito ri ngwenda guthereria ti kunyitwo ati mundu akanyitwo uguo agatonyio ni ithuĩ twetwaraga na magũrũ mau ni ũndũ wa kwenda wega wake wega wa bũrũri witũ na hĩndĩ ĩrĩa mũgũtuona ithuĩ ta rĩu twĩna mwarĩ wa ithe witũ ũyũ ũrona haha rĩ ithuĩ tũrĩ gĩthaka tũtiarĩ atimia twarĩ arũme tondũ gũtirĩ mũtumia wathiĩte gĩthaka wathiĩte kĩ arũi akĩ tondũ maũndũ marĩa marĩ watho-inĩ wa mau rĩ nĩ marĩ na watho mũnene na mũndũ atangĩonire kũrĩ mũtumia kũu ithuothe twarĩ arũi akĩ na mũndũ arĩ mũtumia nĩ akoragwo na mũcinga mũtumia nĩ arũaga mbara na njĩra ĩrĩa angĩrũa tondũ twarĩ arũi akĩ hĩndĩ ĩrĩa mũgũtuona gatagatĩ-inĩ ka arũme mũragia atimia mareka atĩa rĩ ithuĩ mwandĩkage thĩinĩ wa ngoro cianyu atĩ ithuĩ tũtiarĩ kĩ Twarĩ kĩ?
Wale bara.
The courier network was the silent engine that powered the Mau Mau resistance. And at its core were women, operating seamlessly between forests, villages, and urban centers. These women moved undetected through heavily policed colonial spaces, disguised as market vendors, water carriers, or domestic workers. They transported coded messages, smuggled weapons, and gathered critical intelligence, all under the very noses of colonial authorities.
Ona kũrĩa Gĩkũyũ-inĩ rĩ, tũtaingĩrĩte mũtitũ rĩ, nĩndahotaga kũhitha mĩcinga na ndĩngĩoneka. 49 rĩ, ona miuma ĩtarĩ mĩnyue rĩ, niĩ ndaigaga mĩcinga. Twamĩenjagĩra rĩrĩ, mũgũnda mbembe-inĩ. Mwanake ũcio witũ twetaga Kĩhararĩ. Kĩhararĩ. Nĩwe mokaga na andũ acio. Twaigaga tũrĩ acio. Twaigaga niĩ, mũno niĩ, ona nĩngũndĩo ndĩ nyoiki. Ngeta mũirĩtu wetagwo Njoki na nĩakuĩte. Ngeta mũirĩtu ũngĩ na mũtumia wetagwo Kĩhara Wambũi wa Kahara. Wĩra ũcio twarutaga nao. No niĩ ndigĩtwo.
Their perceived invisibility in public life made them uniquely suited for this role. As Caroline Elkins writes in Imperial Reckoning, women's resistance was born out of survival, but it quickly became far more strategic. They provided the Mau Mau with food, water, and intelligence, becoming essential to the movement's operations. In her personal recollections, Mutoni Likimani described the courage and creativity behind even the smallest acts of defiance.
I would pass the notepad over to the detainees through the fence. They would write and pass it back to me, and I would go and post it to their families.
These small exchanges bridged prison walls and sustained the spirit of resistance within the barbed confines of colonial detention. To avoid detection, women relied on coded language, false bottoms in baskets, and cleverly concealed compartments in their clothing. They turned routine into rebellion, blending into everyday life while serving as vital arteries in the lifeblood of the revolution. S.M. Shamsul Alam, in Rethinking the Mau Mau in Colonial Kenya, articulates the scope of their contribution.
In the forest, women participated in battles and carried out reconnaissance missions. In the reserves, they formed the backbone of the movement's logistical network, moving messages, arms, and food. Their role blurred the lines between combatant and supporter.
These women were far more than assistants to the cause. Through ingenuity, loyalty, and unshakable courage, they carried the revolution on their shoulders, operating in silence, often unrecognized. They nonetheless bore the full weight of a nation's dream for freedom. More than a communication tool, the courier network was a military necessity. Messages between forest fighters and their urban or rural supporters needed to be delivered swiftly, accurately, and with absolute secrecy. These messages carried essential intelligence on British troop movements, planned ambushes, and vital supply deliveries.
Ndarutagira wĩra ndĩ mũciĩ rĩu tarĩ gũkũ ndĩ ngatwara riboti ngatwarĩra Kĩmathi onake hĩndĩ o Kĩmathi ndatonyete mũtitũ tondũ aikaraga forest na kwakĩrĩ andũ forest rĩu Kĩmathi aikaraga kũu na nĩndatwaraga riboti ũrĩa gũkũ home ngatira uga ngatwara riboti ngamwĩra akamenya ũrĩa kũrathiĩ na gũgatuĩka nĩ gũgũtũmwo nake Nigetha mathiĩ kũu atĩ nĩ wĩra mararuta na nĩ kĩmathi maratuĩria, ngatwara riboti ĩyo, kĩmathi akagĩa na ũgĩ.
Rĩu mahinda macio rĩ, twairĩtu magagĩthanywo nĩ twanyitagwo mũthenya tũkerwo tũgũthiĩ gũikara ta hau tũrĩ erĩ, nigetha thirikari ĩgĩũka rĩ nĩ barabara-inĩ na mũkorwo mwĩ mũgũnda na mũkorwo mwĩna tũndũ mũreka, muonera haraihu rĩ ũmwe agatũma ũrĩa ũngĩ aikũrũke kũrĩa imaramari ikomete, tondũ kũrĩ hĩndĩ ciakoragwo ciũkĩte ciumĩte na mũtitũ, nigetha we ũthiĩ uge na wokorwo haha nĩ thirikari. Rĩu matinamenya gwathiĩ atĩa, ĩgĩcoka gũikũrũka kũrĩa gũgũkunyanĩirwo rĩ, ũhoro nĩ ũthire mbere na imaramari icio ciora. Rĩu niĩ ndarĩ wa kako nĩguo kwendaga, ndarĩ wa rũhonge rũu.
Guchu Gikonyo, a Mau Mau veteran, recalled how couriers filled multiple roles, carrying messages, transporting weapons, delivering medicine, and tending to the wounded. They achieved by foot what the British military required armored vehicles and aircraft to do. Their work was perilous and demanded discipline, cunning, and extreme bravery. The most efficient of these courier systems connected Nairobi into the forest, and it was known as Kenda Kenda, a nickname borrowed from the fast-moving British police Land Rovers that responded to emergency calls. Before the devastating crackdown of Operation Anvil in 1954, Kenda Kenda ensured that Mau Mau leadership in the city remained in constant contact with fighters in the bush. Messages, arms, money, and directives moved through it with remarkable reliability. So effective was the system that even British intelligence officer Ian Henderson, one of the most feared Mau Mau hunters, admitted.
A terrorist who gave money to a courier in the forest could be almost certain of getting what he wanted from any shop in Nairobi.
Despite the risk of execution under colonial emergency regulations for consorting with terrorists, women couriers kept moving. A scrap of paper could mean death.
Nĩndwaraga riboti rĩ, kaita ũkĩhũrwo ngatigwo hau nguĩte nĩ home guard, ngatigwo mahũrĩire gũkũ nyũmba.
So they memorized entire messages or converted them into coded phrases to avoid interception. To outmaneuver colonial surveillance, women developed an intricate system of code words. An informant's presence, for example, might be announced with a warning like, "The place is swarming with fleas." A British patrol might be signaled with the phrase "Wa irire," which means "the black one." Arms and ammunition were hidden in plain sight behind metaphors. Makara, which means charcoal, referred to ammunition. Kamwaki meant revolver, and Kihi, literally an uncircumcised boy, signaled a gunman. These codes were rotated often to prevent informers from catching on. Market women were masters of this system. From behind their stalls, they shouted warnings, signaled escape routes, and passed information to forest-bound fighters. They also kept communication lines open with Mau Mau leaders detained in colonial camps, sending and receiving messages through new detainees using pre-arranged codes. During the Mau Mau emergency, the British colonial administration forcibly relocated hundreds of thousands of Kikuyu women and children into fortified settlements known as emergency villages. Publicly described as protective measures, these villages were in reality sprawling detention camps designed to isolate the Kikuyu population from the insurgency and dismantle the Mau Mau resistance through control, deprivation, and fear. As Caroline Elkins explains in Imperial Reckoning, the untold story of Britain's Gulag in Kenya,
These villages were surrounded by spiked trenches, barbed wire, and watchtowers, and were heavily patrolled by armed guards. They were detention camps in all but name.
Ona, gĩcagi kĩu nĩ gĩkwenjwo mũkaro. Ũkĩrigiceria na wathuri arĩa akũrũ na tũmwana rĩ, wĩra wao nĩ gũicũhia nyambo cia gũthiĩ kũmundĩrĩra kũ, nĩgetha rĩrĩa maguĩrĩ ũka rĩ, ĩgĩũka kũrũgethecwo, tondũ ndĩrĩ na maitho, manyitaga nyamũ ĩgwĩtwo njege.
life inside was punishing. Women were subjected to forced communal labor from dawn to dusk, digging trenches, clearing land, hauling rocks, often with infants strapped to their backs and no food to sustain them. After sunset, they were confined by curfews to overcrowded makeshift huts. Water was scarce, sanitation nearly non-existent, and disease outbreaks were rampant.
Rĩu icagi icio ciarĩ njũru mũno, mbĩa, ndaa, thuya, ciarĩ nyingĩ mũno, na ng'aragu yarĩ njũru mũno. Ithuĩ tiguo ndĩroiga tondũ rĩu andũ marĩaga ngwacĩ, okorwo nĩ marigũ mokaga magatemengwo. Ũgakora wĩra mũkerwo na nĩ kwanyu, matumia makerwo na athuri ũrĩa mekuo, ona athuri ti aingĩ makoragwo kuo tondũ ũngĩakorirwo wĩ mũthuri, no ũkorirwo wĩ kambĩ. Ũndũ ũngĩikara mwena ũngĩ nĩ ũkũragwo. Rĩu atumia meragwo moke na hiũ, magatemenga marigũ, ikwa, anything. Ona mbembe nĩ ciathiaga gũkũra, mũgakora mũgũnda nĩ mũtemenge wothe. Gũtirĩ kĩndũ gĩa kũrĩa, ciana nĩ ciahũtaga mũno mũno.
As Elkins notes, these conditions resulted in widespread hunger, illness, and despair, especially among the elderly and the very young. Yet even within these barbed wire prisons, women refused to be silenced. They became the quiet heartbeat of the resistance, transforming these spaces of oppression into unexpected hubs of covert defiance. Within the villages, they organized underground networks, smuggled supplies for fighters in the forest, relayed intelligence using coded language, and concealed messages in everyday items, pots, firewood, even folds of clothing. Some women went further, posing as collaborators to gain the trust of colonial guards, only to use that trust to extract information and pass it on to Mau Mau operatives. Even under conditions of near total control, Elkins writes, women found ways to subvert the system. These women, confined behind wire, meant to break them, instead redefined resistance. Through daily acts of courage, caring for their families, shielding secrets, carrying coded whispers, they kept the struggle alive. In silence and in shadows, they fought a war against both colonial violence and historical erasure. For their overt and covert participation in the war, thousands of Kikuyu women were detained in colonial detention centers such as Kamiti, Kajiado, and Athi River. Facilities not built for rehabilitation or justice, but for humiliation, punishment, and control. Branded as sympathizers or supporters of the Mau Mau, these women were subjected to systemic and inhumane treatment at the hands of British colonial forces and their African collaborators.
Kũu kwarĩ mbĩri, kũu nĩ mbĩri, Nä å thiä njera kamä tä å kaherithio nä å rona gä kä ngä kä rä a twakuaga tå rä erä kamä tä na må tigå twara kå nene må kå ruta hau må ige haha må coke muoe må cokie harä a må tigå kua må thenya å tuke nä tå tiatå ire twenjaga maramu harä a monekera kamä tä må no thigari fanya enda haraka rudi kirai kiri kiongo kia maramu.
As Caroline Elkins reveals in Imperial Reckoning the untold story of Britain's Gulag in Kenya, the violence inflicted upon these women was not isolated or random. It was institutionalized and deliberate. Women were beaten until their skin hung in shreds, their breasts scorched with hot coals, and their genitals mutilated with broken bottles, pliers, and rifle barrels. These acts were calculated tools of terror intended to crush the spirits of those who dared to resist colonial rule.
Twethirwa ndira bara bethirwe bwethirwa ni achungu bara butiraruka tomurume akarathwa mukekirwa chuba aikwira tomurume aremwa ikurathwa nu atiyangirwe butikwa kakwi ungi tenjoni enjoni en buro te chocho to angio kokwa ni mau kana buro cho to thira
atumia magekirwa bottles, because I remember that was used to be a huge bottle of Coca-Cola, which was not plastic but actually glass, being put in private parts of a woman. My own relative in Deya, that was done to her. And the ones who refused to tell of the Mau Mau, their breasts were pressed, and the others, most of the people, they were castrated, you know that. Just because those people refused to part with the information, yeah, that which wanted so that they can be incriminated.
At Kamiti, Elkins writes, guards forced women to strip naked, crawl on their hands and knees, and drink water from drained ditches as punishment. This physical brutality was compounded by psychological and verbal abuse. Women were routinely dehumanized, referred to as bloody Mau Mau, and treated not as political prisoners, but as disposable enemies, punished not just for their actions, but for their very identity as Kikuyu, women aligned with the struggle for liberation.
Atumia maikaragirio magacina kiria ibati atumia magaikaririo and my aunt was one na ngiona mami makirira tata ndangĩikarire thĩ na nĩ ahũrirwo rĩu andũ arĩa mendaga gũtocwo mũno atumia maikaragĩrio kĩrĩa ibati na ndingĩagirio atumia erĩ atatũ ndoĩ maikaragĩrio mabati no ũcio John arĩ very famous gũikarĩria atumia mabati
Inside these camps, daily life was a march through suffering. Forced labor was unrelenting, digging trenches, hauling heavy stones, breaking rocks in the sun. Food was scarce, medical care was nearly non-existent. Disease and malnutrition were rampant, and many detainees died without ever being counted, recorded, or mourned. According to Elkins, women often succumbed to starvation, exhaustion, and untreated infections, their bodies buried in unmarked mass graves or behind the camp fences, forgotten by the system that had destroyed them. Official colonial accounts downplayed or denied these atrocities. Yet, through survivor testimonies, a consistent pattern of state-sponsored violence and repression emerges. Many women were punished simply for refusing to confess to fabricated crimes or for their refusal to denounce Mau Mau fighters, torture became a routine method of control, meant not just to extract information, but to annihilate dignity. One woman from Gaikuyu village captured this desperation in a haunting song and addressed to the district officer. Her cry echoes the experiences of countless women who were left behind to raise children in hunger, to navigate violence alone, and to bear the weight of colonial vengeance designed to obliterate both resistance and identity. Yet, despite these brutal conditions, many women did not break. Some maintained resolute silence in the face of torture. Others smuggled messages, slipped banned items through fences, or risked death to help fellow prisoners. A few even managed to escape the camps and rejoin the resistance in the forests. Their strength, forged in the depths of colonial cruelty, speaks to the unyielding spirit that defined the Mau Mau movement. In enduring the unbearable, these women revealed not only the depth of their commitment to liberation, but also the ultimate failure of colonial violence to destroy their will. In colonial Kenya, women were not just supporters of the Mau Mau movement, they were its lifeblood, particularly in urban centers like Nairobi. Through small businesses, domestic work, and informal trade, women embedded themselves in colonial spaces and used those positions strategically. As traders, hawkers, and housemaids, they moved freely and unnoticed, gathering intelligence, relaying messages, and smuggling arms and supplies to fighters in the forest. Their access became their weapon, and they wielded it with quiet determination. Historian Pamela Ngesa highlights how many of these women, particularly those in Nairobi's bustling informal markets, were arrested for aiding Mau Mau fighters. But even arrests and constant surveillance did not deter them. In fact, some left their stalls altogether to join the struggle more directly. As Ngesa notes,
some women chose to leave the streets only temporarily to join the Mau Mau revolt in the hope of carving out a niche for themselves as vendors in Nairobi once the colonial masters were defeated.
These women didn't just dream of freedom, they worked for it. Among the many support structures that sustained the Mau Mau, the courier network stood out as one of the most vital and sophisticated. While much of the Mau Mau story is rooted in the forests of Mount Kenya and the Aberdares, another vital, though less recognized front of the war was fought in Kenya's towns and cities, especially Nairobi. Here, urban women emerged as guerrilla fighters, operatives, and spies, waging war not with rifles, but with strategy, subversion, and stealth.
Gutiare ando Nairobi yo ukuga wa Nairobi ri tikuo imaga Nairobi ri emetoka
nacio rithathi mwarutako
Nairobi cia murungu
cia mĩcingira mwethondekera
cio choimaga kũu.
Many urban women who joined the Mau Mau movement used their positions within settler households, hospitals, or domestic service as a cover for insurgent activity. They turned proximity into power. One extraordinary testimony from Rethinking the Mau Mau in colonial Kenya details the story of a woman who took a maid's job in a settler household in Ndaragwa. Her task was simple but dangerous: identify and map out the location of firearms.
I took a maid's job in a white settler's house in Ndaragwa. My responsibility was to locate the guns in the house. Mau Mau fighters raided the house at night and took away the guns. I left with them to avoid arrest. Later, I was posted near the Nanyuki airport and was involved in gun running. We once had such a big cache of guns that we needed a railway wagon to transport them.
This woman eventually joined the forest wing of the movement as a full-time fighter. She was part of the Hika Hika Battalion, a tactical Mau Mau unit trained for sabotage and rapid deployment missions. In Nairobi, women played a crucial role in the Mau Mau's underground networks, operating as traders, kiosk owners, brewers, laundry workers, and vegetable vendors. They used their public roles as a smokescreen to gather intelligence, move weapons, and deliver messages between forest fighters and urban cells. These women used ingenuity and bravery to conceal messages in baskets of food, folded garments, or even bundles of firewood. They communicated in coded songs and market slang, often carrying information crucial to the survival of fighters hiding in the forests. Some were arrested during Operation Anvil, the colonial government's massive 1954 military operation that swept through Nairobi's African neighborhoods to root out suspected Mau Mau members. Still, many women adapted, using forged documents and false identities to continue their work. One anonymous woman recounted how she worked in 2 different settler households, identifying weapon caches and assisting Mau Mau fighters in planning raids. After those missions, she shifted to gun-running operations near Nanyuki Airport and helped coordinate large-scale weapons transports. At one point, using an entire railway wagon to move arms. Such missions required precision, memory, and immense trust within the Mau Mau's urban command. These women operated under constant risk of betrayal, arrest, or death. For many, the urban war demanded a double life. By day, they were compliant citizens, maids, traders, workers. By night, they were insurgents, strategists, and spies. Some joined Nairobi-based Mau Mau intelligence cells, while others, like those described by H.K. Wachanga, were part of counter-intelligence squads posing as loyalists to gather information from colonial forces and relay it to Mau Mau leadership. Yet not all women aligned with the resistance. Out of fear, survival, or conviction, some collaborated with colonial authorities. A group known as the Hika Hika women, armed with pangas, was known to patrol forest fringes and attack Mau Mau fighters in cooperation with colonial troops.
Riu nĩngwenda gũkwĩra atĩrĩrĩ, ona arĩa andũ acio maregire matuĩka nĩ maragĩtũhũra kana makĩrega tũheo wĩyathi magakĩrega rĩ, na ti kwenda kwao, na andũ acio no aitũ. Nĩ kwaga kũmenya kĩ?
Kwaga ũmenyo.
In response, Mau Mau organized their own loyalist tracking units, including a female group called the Wangu Group, who were tasked with identifying and eliminating traitors within the community, women included. Women played a critical multidimensional role in the Mau Mau War. Their acts of bravery, sacrifice, and resistance spanned forests, villages, prisons, and cities. They were organizers, leaders, seers, strategists, and survivors. Without them, Mau Mau may have faltered. Their names and their stories must never be forgotten.
Go,